Could I just dissociate all of this from that particular remark?
No, but excuse me, I just want to make it clear that this whole field, is full of very unpleasant people, basically. And if you want to do good scientific research in this field of genetics and IQ, I certainly wouldn't deny that's possible. But in order to do that, you have to really strongly dissociate yourselves from the right-wing people, the racist people who have dominated this field for a long time.
I'm really disappointed to hear a scientist
hasn't done that.
I'm really disappointed to hear a scientist proceed in this way, because what you're saying is entirely prejudiced. It's the fact that some knowledge can be used for bad purposes. Obviously, it doesn't imply that knowledge can't be used for good purposes. And the idea that you're going to sort of stop the knowledge from occurring in the first place seems to me, well, really quite an ignorant position, I'm sorry.
Well, actually, that's a rather ignorant position, because if you'd been a working scientist, you would know that it's not a matter of of stopping science. Science gets stopped every day. Gets stopped every day by the people who fund it. There's only 10% of research proposals get approved, and they get approved according to policies that are set by government and which determine the whole agenda of research. It's no surprise that when you have a right-wing government and you have education policy advisors that favour elitist approaches to education, like Dominic Cummings, and he just comes off his paper in bucket loads.
It does not.
His elitism. So it's not surprising that there's an attempt to
from what I've read of it, there isn't a hint of it.
Agendas in a particular direction.
From what I've read of Cummings's, and this is another distortion, from what I've read of Cummings's paper, there is nothing that tends to elitism at all. Can genetic technologies be applied in ways that don't exacerbate existing social inequalities?
Oh, absolutely, of course. And
okay.
I've said so already.
Isn't that simply what people are discussing here? Isn't that what we heard Dr. Asbury saying earlier this evening?
Well, okay. The type of research that we've talking about here actually has a built-in tendency to exacerbate social inequalities. So, for example,
a built-in tendency. That doesn't sound very scientific either.
Let me give you an example of the research project that Robert Plomin is involved with the Chinese Genome Sequencing Centre.
I don't want to go into that at this particular stage. I'm sorry, we just haven't got the time to do that.
The funders of that project are really clear.
No, we're not going to go into that, and also we're not going to libel Professor Plomin. So I'd ask you to consider some of your language and the terms in which you're describing him and his work. I mean, you can disagree with it as a scientist, but not in the way that you have. Matthew Taylor.
Can I ask you to undertake a thought experiment? Let's just imagine the world was run by someone entirely benign and progressive. Say Giles, for example. Mm-hmm. And he was to use the genetic research in order to justify redistribution of resources. He was to say the fact that some children may be slightly further behind than others in certain ways is a very strong argument for saying that luck shouldn't be what sorts of people in society, so therefore we will redistribute money to the less able to create a more equitable society. Would you then be relaxed about the way in which the science was being used?
Yes, on the whole, I think I would. I mean, I think...
So you have no problem with the fact that from the science can be read a policy? So this is my concern. This is my concern with Dr. Asbury, was the idea that you can look at some science and then you can move from the science to saying here are some policy recommendations. Now, it seems to me you're not actually worried about this science to policy move, as long as it's a move you approve of.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think basically we are in a political situation here. Science is highly politicised. We have to take a political position on it. I maintain that this field, historically, as was acknowledged earlier in the programme, very much tends to push education and social policies in general in an elitist, anti-egalitarian direction.
You see, my problem with this is the reductionism of this research. My problem is the idea that the science can enable you to resolve policy problems which are fundamentally issues of morality and politics. It seems to me you're not worried about that reductionism as long as that reductionism leads to the outcome which you support. I don't think scientists really should be in the business of saying my science leads to any policy conclusions. They should say, this is the science. It's not my business, really, to get involved in policy. And in a funny kind of way, in a perverse way, you're actually legitimising people whose views you don't like, because you're kind of saying it's all right to go from science to policy, as long as it's your policy.
I find that's a really weird argument that I've really never heard before. Of course it's all right to go from science to policy. That's exactly what these scientists are trying to do. Scientists do it all the time. We have a debate about GM food. That's informed by science. What's the matter with that? That's not the problem. There's nothing reductionist about that. As a lifelong anti-reductionist scientist, I kind of resent being labelled in that way, actually. The point is, as I keep trying to point out, this particular science is part of a long research agenda which has existed for a century or more, which is absolutely eugenic and which is elitist and technocratic.
The point that I'm trying to make is that when it comes, for example, to issues like education, it comes to the question of whether or not your genetic makeup should be something which is of significance. Whether your genetic makeup should be of significance, regardless of whether you use it in one way or the other, that is a fundamental moral question. And scientists don't... It seems to me that what we're hearing this evening is scientists don't really understand that moral dilemma.
Indeed, scientists are very poor at looking at moral dilemmas. They want to put themselves in this bubble of pure science and objectivity and so on. And they actually have a consistent blind spot about the way in which their research is driven by political ideology, as in this case.
Thank you.
Dr. King, thank you very much indeed. Giles, just picking up one of Dr. King's less lurid points at the end there, that... It's your view, too, is it, that research of this kind, no matter how legitimate it might be scientifically, does tend to end up politically pushing in a broadly elitist way?
Well, my suspicion is that there isn't actually such a thing as pure science versus pure policy. That actually, I agreed with him to the extent that, there isn't this sort of clear fact-value gap, that science is itself value-laden and for various different reasons. And I think this is doubly problematic when we're talking about an area which, I think is fair to say, none of us understand terribly well. And, I don't understand the science of genetics very well. Actually, I don't think any of us around this table understand the science of genetics terribly well. And actually, in that sort of a situation where there's so much we don't understand, I think it's quite right to have as a high degree of suspicion about the way in which certain research can potentially be politicised and steered in a particular direction. And there's a long, long history of that having happened. And I think that's a very, very fair position.
But again, you're Michael, exactly in the position that Matthew described a moment ago, which is that as long as the science leads to a policy of which you approve, you don't mind the science. But if it leads to a policy of which you don't approve, you object to the science. Now, the first thing
you're right, yeah.
What I really object to this evening is that someone like Dr. Kathryn Asbury comes along here, says the research she's done, with which I don't think many people disagree, in other words, that the scientific way in which it's being conducted, then says very clearly that she thinks this could be applied to help the most disadvantaged, and she's then slagged off in the most outrageous terms, not least by Dr. King, saying that these policies, that this work is absolutely eugenic. I mean, it sounded to me absolutely the opposite. But and let me just say one word here. I don't see that there's anything wrong with helping children who have problems in learning and with helping children who are rather good at learning. I think we should be helping both of them. So when you all object to elitists as though that was game, set and match, I don't see why we shouldn't be helping children according to their background.
My criticism of Dr. Asbury is that by moving from science to policy and by not discussing the implications of that science in a deeper way, you go into very dangerous territory. And I think, in a way, Steve Daly might not have expressed himself as well as he could, but there is an important point here. There is a lot of research that shows that if children think intelligence is about your innate ability, it is much less motivating for them than thinking that achievement is to do with... achievement is to do with effort.
No, I understand.
So the very idea that disclosing talent in school is about finding out your innateness rather than releasing your potential has itself effects.
But there's an overall sense in the argument, both with Dr. Asbury and with the second witness, Steve Davey, that these are facts. They're a little bit inconvenient. They cause confusion. Let's ignore them. Melanie?
Well, I'm not sure that they are facts as such. It's highly contested research. Dr. Asbury's research is contested. What struck me about what Dr. Asbury and Dr. Sandberg both said, to listen to them, you would imagine you were listening outside a discussion about genetics to, progressive educationists. All we want to do is advance, the opportunities for most disadvantaged children. They're very, very keen, not surprisingly, to dissociate themselves. As Dr. Asbury said, we want to prove that genetics isn't scary. She has an agenda. She has an agenda to dissociate genetics from eugenics. I don't think she's going to succeed. Dr. Sandberg comes along and says he doesn't want to alter the makeup of the human being. All he wants is educational advances. But he believes in transhumanism, which as I understand it, that goes in for genetic manipulation, cognition-enhancing drugs, bionic enhancement.
Hang on a second.
But at least Dr. Sandberg, it seemed to me, at least Dr. Sandberg was addressing the moral complexity of these issues, and I think I think he should be admired for the nuance in the way in which he was approaching this. I might not agree with the conclusions he drew, but I think he's thinking about and talking about the right questions.
But what
Steve Davey, who was the one who
Michael,
actually,
I was going to ask you about Steve Davey. I thought, incidentally, the school he's at, Wroxham, is outstanding, according to Ofsted. It didn't like to even almost engage with the words ability or intelligence.
No, he did not. He chose his words extremely carefully.
He did.
And for instance, I couldn't get him to say that the research was not implausible. But on the other hand, he did not really seem to revolt from the idea that a large portion of a child's outcomes had to do with the starting point of that child as well as with the interventions that were made during that child's life. So, someone who's actually teaching, it seemed to me, didn't find the research all that shocking. And the second thing was that he said that any information about the child he would find useful. Now, he said he wanted to put it in the context of understanding the child himself, knowing the family background, blah, blah. Of course, all of that is implicit. I mean, remember that the Dr. Plomin research says that 52% of the variation is due to genetics, which means that 48% of it isn't. So he's trying to do something about the 48%. And what some panellists seem to be suggesting this evening is that we should try and do something about the 48%, ignoring the science because we've decided that it's too dangerous.
No.
Giles, he means you.
He does mean me, and I just think that what Michael has done, and I think this is very uncharacteristic of Michael Portillo, is that he's turned off his suspicion. And I think there's something to do with, a test tube and somebody in a white coat, and he just falls over. And that actually all of these things are themselves, there's no just sort of like pure facts, they are themselves, as Dr. King was saying at the end, the result of certain studies that have been funded in certain sorts of ways. All research has a particular sort of angle and so forth, and I think one needs to be very careful not only with how it's driven but also how it's understood. And the idea there's something just pure about it, Michael, I think that's a very naive position to take, and you've turned off your critical vigilance.
I'm not saying there's something pure about it. I'm saying there's something scientific about it, and you don't want to have anything to do with it because you think it might lead to streaming or 11 pluses or something, and you have such clearly determined political positions that you don't want the science to intervene.
Michael, I believe in streaming. You and I probably agree on much to do with education policy, but I'm very suspicious of IQ testing and genetic testing, not because I don't think that genetics plays a part, not because I don't think that nature has something to do with children's ability. Nature and nurture, to me, are very difficult to disentangle. That's my suspicion of the genetic inheritability argument, that I think it's eugenics by the back door.
I think that often science goes wrong, not because it's malevolent, but because scientists are naive.
Yes.
And I think when scientists in this area, they need to think deeply and in a sophisticated and moral way about the implications of what they're doing. And I'm afraid the book that we're discussing, the study we're discussing, the recommendations come with it, don't pass that test for me.
And Michael Portillo, just the idea that there's been a smell of taboo about the whole arguments.
Yes, and isn't that a terrible thing? I mean, as you know, as a grown-up human society, to think that there's a taboo on doing research. Well, what we've seen this evening...
Who said that?
No
one has said that, Michael.
What we've seen here today is the confrontation of science with political prejudice.
OK, let's leave it there. That's it for this week from our panel. Melanie Phillips, Matthew Taylor, Michael Portillo and Charles Fraser, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Burke and produced by Phil Peagam.